Over the last 3 years of the 1950s, civil rights activists had staged small sit-ins at lunch counters in at least 16 cities, but without much success. Little media attention, little support, little momentum. But for some reason, that all began to change on February 1st, 1960, when 4 black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter, and within 2 days, over 85 students, both black and white, had joined them. And Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who had spent much of his early career learning about and advocating nonviolent civil disobedience, had at that point never participated in such an action himself. In fact, he had often kept a distance from the more radical student wing of the burgeoning civil rights movement. But at this moment, he chose to embrace the students, speaking out about their courageous actions and encouraging more of the same. As Taylor Branch puts in his book, Parting the Waters, King embraced the students for taking the step he had been toying with for the past 3 years, of seeking out a nonviolent confrontation with the segregation laws. He had traveled halfway around the world to wrestle with obscure Gandhian conundrums and declared countless times that he was prepared to die for his beliefs. But he had never been quite willing to follow his thoughts outside of the relative safety of oratory. The actions of the students brought to life King's idea that nonviolent civil disobedience was the way to bring down the Jim Crow system. Their actions transformed his idea into a belief. It provided evidence that there was indeed a way forward. As the lunch counter sit-in movement spread across the South in the days and the weeks that followed, King often traveled to buoy the activists. In Nashville, he gave a speech saying that the spirit of their campaign was stronger than the ill will in all the bombers and segregation laws arrayed against them. Segregation was surely finished, he said, though he could not say exactly when it would expire. Well, Taylor Branch writes, as it turned out, the Nashville movement broke segregation at 6 of the major downtown lunch counters only 20 days later. This weekend, many preachers will humbly attempt the task of saying something meaningful about King's life and legacy. And there are also many secular ways to honor Dr. King this weekend, from political rallies to volunteer opportunities, museum exhibits, and more. What is different about remembering Dr. King in the context of a faith community such as this one? Today, I invite us to linger with King not as a static figure of unwavering moral courage, although I believe that he was, but as a dynamic part of a spirit-filled movement, a person whose faith and conviction grew in relationship with other actors, whose moral vision expanded as possibilities for freedom marched forward. Without downplaying King's central role in the movement or his incredible capacity for articulating a moral imagination previously unhearable to the white powers that were at his time, I lift up the relationship between King and the student sit-down movement of the early 60s because it illustrates the dynamism that exists between faith and action, between belief and participation. King's prophetic faith that segregation would begin to crumble under the weight of the lunch counter movement was as much about the actions of the students as it was about his own personal hope for that desired future. It is a case of action propelling belief, creating new possibilities. His conviction and message that segregation was a way of the past was birthed into reality in each minute that a lunch counter stool was occupied by a young black body. His belief that they would win was born of the thousands of students who poured out of classrooms and into the streets. And the articulation of his moral conviction in turn inspired more people to interrupt business as usual, bringing the Jim Crow system into crisis, spurring the necessity of a new reality in which segregation would not be tolerated. The more people believed it was possible to bring down segregation, the more people who worked to make it so. The word epiphany means a sudden insight or a new understanding. It comes from the Greek word epiphanein, meaning to reveal or to be manifest. Here, now in the season of Epiphany, we are focusing on what it means to have Jesus revealed to us. How was Jesus' divinity revealed to those around him in the course of his ministry? And how do we come to understand or to believe in Jesus, as I was asking the children earlier? Well, in our gospel reading today, not everyone who witnessed Jesus' sign of changing water into wine recognized it as a miracle. Not everyone believed. But the servants who had drawn the water knew. The disciples, who had already left everything to follow Jesus, they came to believe. And I imagine that Jesus' mother, who sort of set this whole thing in motion, also must have known. They each played a part. Their actions were critical to the unfolding of this sign. One might say that they helped Jesus reveal his glory in that moment. The servants in our story filled up 6 stone jars with 20 or 30 gallons of water. Who knows how far they had to walk to the well to get the water, how heavy the vessels that they carried were. And I realize this is an ahistorical image, but I imagine all of this being done in the midst of a big party with much revelry, loud music. Perhaps they're having to dodge dancers on the dance floor or avoid the few wayward souls who had imbibed too much of the first round of wine. It was a lot of work, to say the least. And so it's not a surprise that they knew where the wine had come from. It came from their very labor, at least in part. While Jesus did the transformation, they provided the raw material. The steward, their boss, so to speak, the one who tasted the water, he must not have been trained as a sommelier because the miracle of this wine was lost on him. We're led to believe that it was lost on him, on the bridegroom, and indeed on the vast majority of the wedding attendees. But the participants in the process, they are the ones to whom Jesus revealed his glory. And so it is fitting then that in John's gospel, we don't find out the details. We don't witness that precise moment of epiphany. We hear instead about who was involved and the impact that it had on them. John dwells not on the mechanics. Did Jesus have to touch the water to transform it? At what point was it transformed? Was it still in the vessels, or did it happen at the moment it was poured out to drink? Was the wine red or white? I guess that one might not be as important. It's almost as if John is saying that the important transformation in the story was not of the wine, but of the people. Jesus' first sign was not of water into wine, but of ordinary people into believers, into enactors of God's transformative power. William Sloane Coffin once wrote that Christianity is primarily a way of life, not a system of belief. But in this story, at least, there is a relationship between the two. The dialectical relationship between belief and action led the disciples to take their first steps to follow Jesus before he even performed this sign. And yet, the sign mattered. It propelled them forward in their discipleship, led them to continue on this journey. Certainly, Martin Luther King Jr. knew the prophetic possibility of nonviolent civil disobedience, but seeing the success of the students in Greensboro brought his conviction to bear with renewed force. And for us, surely each of us could look back at our own lives, seeing events that have brought us closer or farther from faith. What actions have we taken that, looking back, we now recognize as strengtheners of our faith? Or of points that transformed our faith from a system of belief that we subscribe to or affiliate with into our very way of life? What we do shapes what we believe. Or better said, our actions shape the boundaries of our beliefs. If we do not pray, how can we believe that God answers prayers? In whatever form our faithful actions take, whether they are worship, prayer, contemplation, meditation, care of ourselves, of body, mind, and spirit, care of creation, of earth and all those who inhabit it, participation in church, loving our neighbors, and possibilities as unique as each believer. These are the ways and the places that we invite God to become real, that we invite God to transform our human ways into something more, to take the waters of our lives and supply the richness of wine. Now, there are stories, certainly, of miracles, of extraordinary events that required no participation, so to speak, on the part of the believer. And I hope, maybe, that there are such stories here in this congregation, and for that we give God thanks. But I think that the more common miracles are the slow ones. If they were books, these would not be the page-turners. If they were a television series, we would likely tune out after just a few episodes. But mercifully, God does not operate like a television executive. God must be more like a hand-cranked radio. You have to put a little muscle in before the station comes in clear without all the static. Or maybe, like some runners might describe happening after the 10-minute mark of running, that it ceases to be tedious and becomes transcendent. I cannot personally attest to that one. I can attest to it being like the kneading of bread, that transformation comes slowly, imperceptibly coming to life with each fold of the dough. These slow miracles in our lives, they're like the way one person who thinks that the sadness of grief will never lift, one day finds themselves smiling at a small moment. Still sad, but no longer only sad. It is the way someone else who has been carrying a burden all alone finally finds someone who will share the load. It is someone else's daily prayers for courage and strength being answered in their willingness to take a life-affirming risk. We might point to that moment of transformation as the place where God acts, but isn't each step we take along the way to get to that place just as much a testimony to our faith? Just as much evidence of God's participation in our lives and our participation in God's ways. Richard Rohr writes, "For the better part of the past 1,600 years, Christianity has put a lot more emphasis on the things we know about Jesus. The word orthodox has come to meaning having the correct beliefs. Along with the overt requirement to learn what these beliefs are and agree with them, comes a subliminal message that the appropriate way to relate to Jesus is through a series of beliefs." He goes on to say that Christian orthodoxy should be about is not belief or right belief, but about right practice. And this celebration of practice is one of Rohr's greatest gifts to contemporary Christianity. Practice, the repetitive act of trying and trying and trying again. The students who over and over again sat down for the end of segregation, who inspired a movement, a nation, and a leader. The servants who drew the water, not knowing that the work that they did day in and day out would that day have a very different outcome. And each of us, in our own spiritual journeys, day in and day out seeking a connection with God, and one day finding that we have been transformed by our journeys. It is these ordinary moments and ordinary people who are so often overlooked in the gospel, in history, and even in the parts of ourselves that we don't honor enough. and in times that challenge our faith, challenge our conviction that we could be co-creators of the beloved community, that we are on our way to the reign of God, that we most crave a dramatic sign. Times like these that we most lament the absence of a clear leader like King for our times. But epiphanies come most often when we are already on our way. If we have already started to the well to fill the jars with water, if we are already on the lunch counter stool or on our way to a march, if we are already in prayer, already seeking community. We'll never know what day it will be that the transformation will come, the day when the movement will catch fire or the water transformed, but it is up to us to participate in that process. God invites our holy participation. Amen.